For thousands of years, soldiers could only attack what they could see and reach with their own hands. Eventually, humanity invented a weapon capable of hurling the force of an entire army across walls, trenches, and eventually hundreds of kilometers. But every time artillery shot farther, a new problem emerged. It became heavier, slower, less accurate, or easier to detect. It was precisely this chain of problems that transformed a simple wooden sling into networked firepower systems capable of receiving coordinates from radar, satellites, and drones. The first evolution of artillery was not a complex machine at all, but rather an extension of the human body. Before approximately 3000 BCE in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and other ancient civilizations, human arms alone could not hurl an object far or hard enough. The invention of the sling allowed users to store rotational momentum and release a stone at a much higher speed than a standard throw. Sling-wielding units appeared in Egyptian and Assyrian art, enabling ancient armies to strike from beyond the range of many close combat weapons. This increased range without requiring overly complicated projectiles, though the weapon's power still depended heavily on individual human physical strength and skill. As warfare evolved, larger bows could shoot with greater force, but humans lacked the raw physical strength required to draw them. Around the 4th century BCE in Greece, engineers placed a massive bow onto a wooden frame and introduced a mechanical mechanism to pull the string, giving birth to the oxybeles as one of Greece's earliest mechanized bow weapons. For the first time, a weapon's energy was no longer strictly limited by the shooter's instant muscle pull, successfully launching large arrows or spears with much greater and more stable force. However, these large composite bows ultimately became heavy, bulky, and difficult to scale up any further. Because traditional wooden bows hit strict limits in size and durability, Macedonian forces under Philip II and Alexander the Great, around 340 BCE, developed torsion catapults that utilized bundled animal sinews or twisted fibers to store mechanical energy. These machines created an artificial spring, rather than mimicking a simple bow, allowing engines to be built in various scales and capable of launching much heavier payloads during Alexander's campaigns. Nevertheless, the accuracy and operational performance of these torsion engines remained heavily dependent on tension, weather humidity, and the overall condition of the twisted fiber bundles. By the 1st century BCE to the 2nd century CE, individual siege machines were no longer sufficient for a sprawling Roman Empire that required standardized, mass-produced weaponry operated with organizational discipline. The Romans standardized various types of ballistae and integrated them directly into regular military units, deploying them during sieges and battlefield engagements to fire heavy bolts or stones. This breakthrough transformed mechanical firepower into a permanent fixture of legionary armies rather than improvised tools built solely for a single siege. Still, ballistae primarily fired along relatively flat trajectories and required direct line of sight to their targets. Because low-trajectory weapons struggled to hit targets hidden behind fortifications or obstacles, the Romans introduced the onager around the 4th century CE, utilizing a twisted torsion arm to fling stones along a high, curved trajectory. Artillery no longer had to strike the front face of a target head-on, allowing it to arc projectiles over defensive walls and hit forces sheltered behind them. Despite this tactical advantage, the machine generated severe structural shockwaves, suffered from inconsistent performance, and proved difficult to maneuver across rough terrain. To bypass the climate sensitivity and mechanical complexity of torsion systems, ancient engineers popularized the traction trebuchet by the 6th century across East and West Asia, where a team of men pulled on ropes attached to the short end of a lever to launch a payload from the other. This concentrated human collective energy into a single timed moment via leverage, offering a simpler structure and a relatively high rate of fire. Yet every single launch depended entirely on whether the entire crew pulled with synchronized timing and uniform force. To overcome the human inconsistency of traction teams, The 12th century brought the counterweight trebuchet to the Mediterranean and Middle East, replacing muscle power with a heavy dropping counterweight that pulled a long arm and a sling. Operating without explosives, these massive medieval siege engines harnessed gravity to hurl heavy stones with relatively repeatable energy over substantial distances. However, the machines were colossal, required extensive time to construct, and still struggled to smash thick stone walls instantly. As the 10th to 13th centuries unfolded in Song Dynasty China, military engineers realized that a physical stone only caused damage via kinetic impact, prompting them to pack gunpowder mixtures and incendiary materials into projectiles launched by trebuchets. Part of the destructive energy was now carried inside the projectile itself, allowing shells to ignite fires or explode upon reaching the target. Even so, the trebuchets required to throw them remained massive, slow, and severely restricted in changing their firing azimuth. By the 13th and 14th centuries in China, West Asia, and Europe, mechanical throwing frames were rendered obsolete by the invention of the hand cannon and early bombard, which trapped the expanding gases of gunpowder inside a metal tube to propel a projectile. Energy chemistry generated massive force within a structure far smaller than a trebuchet, reducing an entire siege engine down to a single metal barrel. The earliest guns, however, suffered from poor accuracy, high failure rates, and difficulties in manufacturing uniform components. By 1453, the Ottoman Empire under Mehmed II famously deployed massive bombards, often associated with the engineer Orban, to repeatedly pound the same section of the legendary Theodosian walls at Constantinople. Artillery no longer needed to destroy an entire city. It only needed to blast a single breach wide enough for an assaulting army to flood through, rendering towering medieval stone defenses obsolete against concentrated gunpowder force. Still, these early siege bombards were agonizingly heavy, fired at a snail's pace, and practically impossible to maneuver in open field battles. To fix the structural weaknesses of early built-up iron bars that leaked expanding gases, 15th and 16th century European metalworkers in Italy and France began casting gun barrels out of bronze as single, unified blocks. Metallurgy proved just as critical to the evolution of artillery as gunpowder chemistry, yielding barrels that were significantly stronger, tighter, and structurally stable. Nevertheless, these cannons still required heavy wooden carriages and cumbersome logistical support to position them effectively. By the late 15th century, under King Charles V, France revolutionized military mobility by introducing lighter mobile field guns mounted on two-wheeled carriages pulled by horses during the Italian Wars. Artillery was finally liberated from prolonged static sieges, transforming into a mobile unit capable of marching alongside armies and delivering devastating firepower directly onto dynamic battlefields. However, direct fire cannons still struggled to hit targets safely hidden behind hills or behind field fortifications. To bypass obstacles and strike targets tucked behind cover, European and Ottoman engineers between the 15th and 17th centuries developed the mortar, featuring a short barrel elevated at a steep angle to launch projectiles along a plunging, high-arc trajectory. Instead of trying to smash through thick walls head-on, mortars simply sailed over them to rain destruction from above. The primary trade-off, however, was that high-angle curved trajectories were notoriously difficult to calculate, leading to low initial accuracy. Bridging the tactical gap between flat-firing cannons and high-angle mortars, Central European armorers in the 17th and 18th centuries introduced the howitzer, which combined barrel lengths and elevation ranges to accommodate a versatile spectrum of intermediate trajectories. It became one of the most practical pieces of ordnance on the battlefield, able to clear obstacles while remaining far more mobile and responsive than heavy siege mortars. Even so, widespread international use was hampered by a chaotic lack of standardized calibers, ammunition, and transport carriages among different nations. In the 1760s, French military innovator Jean-Baptiste Vaquet de Gribeauval radically reformed artillery by introducing the Gribeauval system, which standardized gun calibers, interchangeable parts, carriage designs, and manufacturing procedures. The French military could finally field lighter field guns with streamlined logistics, greatly enhancing battlefield mobility and repair efficiency. Yet smoothbore barrels and spherical cannonballs continued to cap both maximum range and precision. By the mid-19th century, industrial powers like Britain and Prussia transformed artillery performance through the introduction of rifled barrels and breech-loading mechanisms, exemplified by Armstrong guns and Krupp steel systems. Spiral rifling forced elongated projectiles to spin along their longitudinal axis, drastically improving flight stability, accuracy, and range. Despite these monumental leaps, every time a gun fired, the massive recoil still shoved the entire carriage backward, forcing the gun crew to manually reposition and re-aim the weapon after every single shot. In 1897, France solved the persistent recoil headache by introducing the legendary Canon de 75 Model 1897, featuring a revolutionary hydro-pneumatic recoil system that allowed the barrel to slide backward while the carriage remained firmly anchored in place. To achieve higher firing speeds, gunners no longer needed to reload faster. They simply needed a system that kept the gun from shaking out of alignment. This drastically accelerated sustained fire rates, while maintaining a locked-in target heading. Between the late 19th century and World War I, armies mastered indirect fire, allowing batteries to position themselves hidden behind reverse slopes or forests while forward observers, maps, and field telephones relayed coordinates to unseen gun crews. Guns, howitzers, and mortars no longer needed direct line of sight to their targets, merging massive distributed firepower across the front lines, though poor data or entrenched enemy positions still resulted in devastating tactical stalemates like the Battle of the Somme in 1916. During the 1930s and 1940s, military forces across Germany, the Soviet Union, and the United States pushed artillery into the age of mechanization, with self-propelled guns, such as the German Wespe and Hummel, or the American M7 Priest, and massive rocket barrages like the Soviet Katyusha BM-13. This split artillery into two distinct doctrines: traditional gun barrels optimized for precision and sustained support, and rocket launchers designed to saturate an area with massive destructive mass in seconds. Yet, rocket dispersion remained wide, and self-propelled units were still vulnerable to counter-battery radar. By the late 20th century and into the modern era, armies integrated networked precision artillery, transforming standalone weapons into automated loops driven by GPS-guided or laser-guided munitions, counter-battery radars, battlefield drones, and digital data links. Systems like the HIMARS, introduced into service in 2005, use mobile launchers to fire precision-guided pods across vast distances, allowing modern artillery to calculate atmospheric conditions and course-correct munitions mid-flight. Modern artillery is no longer just a metal tube. It is a unified network where sensors find targets, computers compute coordinates, and smart munitions self-correct. Though the proliferation of modern tracking sensors means contemporary batteries must shoot, scoot, and hide faster than ever before to survive.